And I'm here to talk about my pilot dissertation research that I did this summer, thanks to the Tinker Foundation and class, on primate predator-prey interactions, specifically between bald-faced Takis monkeys, these guys right here, and their felid predators such as jaguars, pumas, and other felids, as you'll see in a second. So I did research in southeastern Peru, in the Department of Anthropology, you can see in black. And the field site is called the Los Amigos Biological Station, here highlighted. It's in Peru's first conservation concession. So it's a really important location for conservation because it serves as a corridor, this region, as a corridor between two major protected areas. So you have Manu National Park, and you can't see here on the map, but there's Tambopata National Reserve, so it's an important location for conservation. And I want to talk very briefly about the focal primate species, Baldfaced Takis. There's not much published in the literature on this species, so you might not have heard of them before or know much about them. They're locally called the wapo, mono-wapo. They're highly territorial species, so when they come across another Saki monkey group, they engage in these long territorial bouts where they call back and forth to each other. And they are considered socially monogamous in the literature. So what that means at my study site, they live in very small groups. Typically you just have one adult male, one adult female, and then their offspring. So there are not very many eyes and ears to listen and pay attention to predators. So they may be more vulnerable to predators than other primate species. So in the primate literature, we know that there's evidence that raptors, such as harpy eagles, ornate hawk eagles, are serious threats to primates, neotropical primates. But we don't know a whole lot about how often felids predate on primates or if they affect their behavior. So that's what I'm interested in. And one of my dissertation questions is whether Saki monkeys are perceptive or aware of movements and activity of felids. So if they are aware of these movement patterns and activity patterns, then we would expect that the monkeys will change their behavior in parts of their home range where felids are more active, or at times of the day when felids are more active. And if they are changing their behavior, then this suggests that they do perceive them as threats. Before, though, I could answer this really broad question, I needed to do some preliminary research to see if I could even collect the kind of data that I would need to answer that question. So that's what my goal was this summer. So I had three objectives. One was to collect group location data on Saki groups to identify future study groups. The second was to conduct a 45-day camera trap survey. And the purpose of this was to see how useful camera traps were to actually monitor felid movement in Saki monkey home ranges. And then the third thing was to target, oh, it changed it all to one. The third thing was to target areas for future ocelot trapping. So I'm returning in March of 2014 for a 16-month-long study. And the first thing I'm going to do when I get there is trap and radio collar ocelots for more detailed monitoring. So I wanted to see what's the best places to go to set up traps. So this summer, the first thing I did was locate Saki groups by doing 22 transects. And this is a map of the trail system. The trails are all these lines. And what I would do is slowly walk just 2-kilometer sections of the trail, listening for Sakis. And if I didn't find any on this first walk, I would re-walk the transect. And then every 50 meters I would stop, and I'd have a speaker and an iPod, and I would play a sound of their own territorial calls. Remember I said they're highly territorial. And I have a sample of the call. Hopefully it plays. The volume was down on here, but they are very loud calls. They carry really far. So once I would find a group, I would follow them throughout the day, and I have my GPS here, and every 10 minutes I just take a GPS point. And then at the end of the summer, when I came back to OSU, I was able to take all of the points for each group that I followed, throw them into software called ArcGIS, and then that allows me to create these nice maps of the group's home ranges. So the shaded area here, purple is one group, the green is a second group that I followed. So now when I return in 2014, I know where to find groups, and I have a good idea of how far they range. So the second thing I did was take camera traps, which are remotely activated cameras. The picture right here of a camera trap that are triggered by motion or infrared sensors. And I would set them up on one trap on each side of the trail. So each station had 2 camera traps, and this allowed me to get images or videos of both sides of the animal, which is important for identification. I think jaguars and ocelots have unique spot patterns. So this is that map again of the trail system and the ranges. This summer I did a camera trap survey in just one group's home range. When I return, I'm going to do it in each of the study group's home ranges. But the stars represent where I placed the camera trap stations. You can see these 2 bottom ones fall a little bit outside of the home range, but that's because when I first got there I wasn't quite familiar with the home range yet. So when I go back now I'm familiar, I have a better idea of where to place the cameras. And you place them in a grid system to try to cover most of the group's range. When I return, I'm also going to put some off trail as well. So just some preliminary results. Ignore the right column for a second. In terms of the felids that I captured with the camera traps, I captured all 5 species that are present at the site. And you can see total number of photos. The most photos were of jaguars, and then following right behind them were ocelots with 39, then pumas, margays and jaguarundis I didn't capture very frequently. That's because they're much smaller cats, so they spend most of their time up in the trees. They're highly arboreal. So I captured a total of 116 photos or videos of felids. And then if you look at this right column, independent photos or independent events, I captured 54. The reason why this is so much lower is because if you have a cat wandering around an intersection where a camera trap is, they may wander around and hang out for 10 minutes. This will trigger the cameras multiple times. So it's one independent photo event of one animal on one occasion, but it yields multiple photos or videos. But if you think my survey was 45 days, and there were 54 independent events. So this is a lot of cats showing up on the camera traps, which I knew I'd find that they would show up, but I did not realize or expect that many on there. I was also able to identify core ocelot areas. Most of those 39 photographs showed up on the same 2 camera stations, which I believe is Station 6 and Station 4, which could be tied to the habitat. They may prefer habitat in that area. And then I also was able to identify a potential den site down here, Station 1. And the reason for that is that I had multiple photos throughout the 45 days of this mother, this ocelot mother. She's in the intersection looking out, and her kitten, it's hard to see, I have a video in a second I'll show you, is running towards her. They appeared, this pair, multiple times on that same station, suggesting that a den was somewhere nearby, which is important because now I have a good idea of where they may be denning, a general area, and then also the other 2 camera stations, those are core ocelot areas that I'll target when I return for trapping. So some basic outcomes of this pilot research. I now have identified 6 stocky monkey groups, and then 4 of those 6 I've been able to collect home range data on. So I have a general idea. Remember, my study was only in the summer, so their home ranges are probably a lot larger if you count for the rest of the year. But I have a good idea of where to go to find my focal groups. I also know felids are abundant at the site, but more importantly, I know that camera traps are useful and highly successful in capturing felids and showing their movement within the monkey's home range. I also had a lot of experience fixing technical difficulties with the cameras, things I didn't expect, and I had to fix them while I was there because I was isolated out in the jungle. So I can now do that better when I return. And probably most importantly, I'm creating a camera trap image database. So in addition to felids, I captured over 22 species of mammal, quite a few species of birds on the camera traps. So I'm taking all of these photos and videos and putting them in a database, which will be available to the public, also researchers. And then also, it's important for conservation. I'll be doing a 16-month-long study and adding photos continuously to the database. So throughout this time, if I show that there's an abundance of mammals, a wide diversity of mammals, and if I show that they're increasing over time, this would suggest that this conservation corridor model is working, which has implications for the future. And I'm going to show you guys a short video I put together with all of the images, well, not all of the images, a small handful of images, but of various mammals. I don't know how to make this leave it like that. Jaguar hung around throughout the 45 days. I have a lot of video of that particular jaguar. You can see the spot pattern really clearly, and that's how we were able to identify There's the mother and kitten. So I showed the image of. Have fun with the camera traps. As you can see, there is a wide diversity of mammals that also show up in addition to felids. And in conclusion, I just want to thank the Tinker Foundation and also class and the Department of Anthropology for providing me with the opportunity to do the pilot research this summer. It will really expedite and critically improve my dissertation research when I return in March.
And I'm a master's student at Rural Sociology at School of Environment and Natural Resources. And I'm just going to start also getting a dual degree in Latin American Studies. So this summer, I was in Peru. I did most of my work in Lima, Huaraz, and Cusco. So I'm just going to go through a really short background about my research. Then we'll go through some of the questions, my main objectives for the exploratory research, some of the findings, and then what's going to come next for my following 2 years of work. So I'm sure some of you might be familiar with this, but Peru is the second producer of copper, third producer of zinc and tin, and fourth in the production of lead in the world. So there's a lot of mining activity going on, and I'm focusing mainly in the Andean region. 15% of the national territory is already being granted to mining concessions. That doesn't mean that everything's being mined, just about 1% is mined of the entire territory. But what's interesting is that 58% of the exports are mining extraction minerals, right, from Peru. On top of this, so you have this going on the economy side of Peru, but what I'm looking at is that the social, one of the aspects of what I'm looking at is that the social environmental conflicts that go along with this type of economy in Peru. So, for example, I'm basing my observations on conflict based on the Ombudsman's office, which is a regulatory office, part of the government, and they register conflict, throughout the country. You can tell here that about 50% of the conflicts in social and environmental are coming from mining conflicts. And these conflicts vary from environmental conflicts on contamination, then communities demanding that the companies don't follow their agreements that they have either with the government or with the communities. And one of the most known recent conflicts is the one in Conga in Cajamarca. But there are other conflicts, continual conflicts in Ancash and Antamina, is one of the biggest copper mines in Huaraz. Lots of examples of this there. Okay. So what's going on now? One, last year, 2011, Peru passed this law called Law of Prior Consultation, which is based on the ILO, the International Labour Organization International Convention. This says that indigenous communities have the right to be consulted on any development project that would affect them directly. Okay, this is from 1989, but Peru ratified this in 1994. Yeah. Just for your reference, I put the list of the only 22 countries signed this international convention, and there you see them highlighted in green. So this law is passed in 2011. Just a reminder, in Peru you have first passing of the law, and then after that is the implementation of the law. So they don't go together. So passing the law doesn't really mean much, it's just a piece of paper and signing. But that actually, so they passed the law in 2011, and they were the first ones to do this in the world, yes. And what's the idea? So the idea is that with passing of this law that the conflict is going to decrease. And this is what all politicians say in the mainstream media, and everyone claims that that's going to happen. We implement this law, we're going to decrease conflict. So I went out with this idea of trying to figure out what the reaction is to this law, because it just seems to be very easy for that to happen. So, oh, we have the law, we'll solve the conflict. But I kind of didn't see that happening that straightforward. So I was interested in looking at the NGOs, mainly their responses to the law. And I'm saying NGOs because they work very closely to communities, so they could provide me with their perspective of what their reactions and their feedback about this law. Then I'm also looking at some of the problems and some of the complications that they're having with this law. Then I'm looking at also, well, one of the main questions is whether this law will create this collaboration and participation that they were claiming that it was going to happen, right, with the implementation of this. And whether there were demanding NGOs and impacted communities a alternative type of development outside of mining. So I went out to Peru this past summer for about 2 months. So I have 3 objectives. I needed to define a research question for my thesis, for my thesis for the next 2 years. I wanted to meet with a varied range of groups of people that would have maybe different opinions on the current situation in Peru, in conflict and mining. So I wanted to meet with academia, professors, with local NGOs, with government officials, and private institutions like mining companies. And also I needed to find an affiliation with a local research organization. So that's in general my three goals. Pretty quickly on my methodology, I put it together in an Excel spreadsheet and a Microsoft Word spreadsheet, because I was able to identify some of the key players or key individuals that I thought it would be important to talk to. And I needed to identify their organizations and just have some broad questions that I wanted to bring up, right? And I was able to talk to all these organizations here that you see. Defensoría del Pueblo is the Ombudsman office. I was able to talk to representative in Huaraz, the regional office, and in Lima. Antamina, I was able to talk to a representative from community relations manager, community relations individual, and he gave me a lot of insight about some of the causes of conflict between the mining companies and the communities. With the Católica, Centro Bartolomé Las Casas is a research organization in Cusco. And the reason kind of why I put this here is because there's a lot of people that are involved in right now doing research on this law. So everyone is like on board, right? So everyone is very interested about what's going to happen with this. So some of my early findings. So this international law and the passing of the law in Peru, it says that this consultation would only apply to indigenous people. So now Peru is kind of stuck in the stage of who are the indigenous people, right? Which I didn't think it would be very problematic, but it is. It's a huge deal. And they just released yesterday only 4 communities, four or five communities this week about who are indigenous organizations. Just to give you an example of the problems that are facing, the president, Ollanta Humala, he said that there are no indigenous communities in the Andes, that we only have peasant communities in the Andes and not indigenous communities in the Andes. So you see a lot of reactions from academia and NGOs saying, well, wait a minute, you gotta go back to your history or anthropology, or, you got it all wrong. So that's what was happening at this stage this past summer. What was interesting is that I was talking to the research organization in Cusco, and I was wondering, so when is this actually going to be implemented? And they said, well, it's probably going to take about a year to figure out who the indigenous people are, so everyone agrees. And then maybe next year we'll start implementing this. So yeah, and that was a problem for me because I wanted to look at the implementation phase of this law in practice, right? So I said, well, I can't do this because this is a master's and I'm not going to have time to do that. Okay, so not only they don't know who the indigenous people are, they also can't agree who's going to be in charge of implementing this law. So you have the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Energy and Mines, and the Ministry of Culture, and they all kind of arguing with each other about, no, you're responsible, you're supposed to be, you're going to be in charge of implementing this. So they all kind of blaming each other about who's in charge. There's also another problem that I've noticed because I was able to attend 2 conferences, one in Lima and one in Cusco, about misinformation and not really knowing what this law means and not really knowing how it would benefit the communities. So they want to build some capacity building in the communities and also within organizations, kind of to, the way that I saw it was kind of to get ready for when this law was going to be in practice. So, now, what am I going to do next? The first thing that I kind of thought was, well, aren't there participatory mechanisms already in place that maybe they would have looked at before passing this law? That was kind of my logic. and then they could make assumptions on whether this law would lead to collaboration and participation and decrease conflict. But that didn't happen. The law was passed in a time when there's a lot of political conflict. There was this Bagua incident, protest in the lower Amazon, where a lot of protesters died and a lot of police officers died. So as a response, this law was passed, Congress signed it, the president said, okay, we have a law, this is our response to the conflict of Bagua. So that's the background really of when the law was passed, right? Then I'm asking people around, say, well, what about the current participatory mechanisms that I've come upon in environmental impact assessment? So in order to a mining company, a mining project to be approved, they need to have this participation workshops in each of the affected communities, directly impacted communities. And it seemed like no one, well, everyone has a general idea of what happens. It's like, oh, well, they just come in, they give you a spill of what the environmental impact assessment is going to be like, and there's not really a consultation or consent type of process. So I said, well, maybe I could look at those processes of consultation that are already in place and that are already taking, in order for each environmental impact assessment, they have to have about 2 or 3 workshops and 1 final audiencia. Audiencia is just a workshop that is extended to the public as well. So my idea is now to go back next summer and look at both doing documentary research and doing ethnographic research. So document research, I will look at the legal processes that and laws and regulations that tell you about the participation that they need to fulfill and all the requirements that the mining company has to fulfill. And also I want to look at the actual practice of these workshops that are taking place. Ideally, I will go and sit into one of them. I haven't identified which one it would be, but I would otherwise be able to access to recordings because they are required to record if it's not voice, it's video, and also look at the environmental impact assessments themselves, kind of to compare what is being told to the communities and what it says on the documents, right? Yeah, these are some photos of my research. And that's it. Oh yes, everything here for the money. That was helpful.
Lovely photos.
Well, let's say I went to a queer fashion show. I don't know if you ever heard. Yes. Pretty exciting.
Oh my God.
So that's a queer. Yeah. That was one of my highlights of the trip. Yes. That's in Lima. It's pretty miserable over the winter. 6 months out of the year it's like that in Lima, right? This is Cusco, and this is one of the markets outside of Cusco where I was able to speak some Quechua with some of the ladies there, and that was pretty exciting. Wait, that's too fast. You're in the advanced level. Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm Monica Garcia Blizzard. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and the title of that I've given for this is Colorism and the Ethnographic Gaze in Mexican Film. So, those of you that know me and are my classmates or my professors, you know that my graduate studies have been propelled by the obsession with whiteness in Mexican visual culture, right? So the lack of representation of the wide phenotypical variety of the country, particularly in audiovisual media. This is very obvious, very apparent when looking at Mexican film, as I have been doing throughout my graduate studies. So in time, I became particularly interested in how this tendency affects, in particular, the representation of women And so another way of asking this question is, why is the leading woman always white? Right? Why is she never indigenous? Why is she never visibly mestiza in commercial Mexican film, right? So from a lifetime of exposure to Mexican cultural production, from personal experience because my family is Mexican, and now as a scholar in training, it's not difficult to make the link, between this situation and to assess that it is a manifestation of the way in which the standards of beauty are inextricably linked to racism and ultimately to the experience of colonialism, whereby everything associated with the colonizer was imposed as superior, including the phenotype, right? However, what's interesting when analyzing the context of Mexican film is that obviously it takes off after the revolution. So, and of course with the revolution comes the official ideology of indigenismo mestizaje. So then you have this issue of, well, okay, how do I analyze this in the face of a blatant state-sponsored ideology that supposedly exalts mestizaje and the indigenous culture? Okay, and that's where the concept of colorism is very useful to me. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the idea of colorism, it basically attempts to describe the preference for whiteness even when the currency of like a hard racist ideology is no longer in vogue, right? Okay, let's see, where can we go from? Okay, so then in my studies, right, how this project began. So then in my studies here at OSU, I began to analyze, the materials that were available to me, which came from the quote-unquote golden period of Mexican film, roughly from the early 1940s to the 1960s. And this period produced a lot of indigenista film, right? So film that supposedly represents the indigenous experience in a very specific way, right? Which I don't have time to go into here. So, okay, so here, for example, we had 1944, Emilio Fernandez's Maria Candelaria, right? We have Dolores del Rio interpreting what is supposed to be a, indigenous woman, and we also have the, equally famous Maria Felix in the role of Maclovia in 1948. Okay, so I was working with these materials, and then over a period of time, what happened? Why I needed to go to Mexico. Basically, the questions multiplied, right? So I started to ask, well, why? And is this something typical to the golden age of Mexican film, or does it come from somewhere before? Basically, I just needed to solve, to address the larger problem of how was film used in relation to the indigenous prior to the golden age of Mexican film. Okay, so that means, okay, if the golden age is in the 1940s, that means I have to start looking at the 1930s, the 1920s, and before. So as Jose Diaz can tell us, right, I was in touch with him all of last year trying to get some materials, and unfortunately when they are so old and there are not very many reproductions of them, people don't want to lend them. It's very difficult to get access to them. A lot of times they've been put together in specific institutes from negatives that have been found in private collections. So basically I just started to run into a logistical problem of trying to put this trajectory of Mexican film in relation to the indigenous together. So that's when I applied for Tinker funds and I got them. Okay, so where I went to the Filmoteca at the UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. See that I actually was there, so just so you can see. So why is this a good place to go? They have an extensive collection, right? Also, many of the films themselves, especially some of the early first things that were ever recorded in Mexico, they have actually been restored there. So I can talk to the people that were restoring them, how they were found, that kind of thing, which is a very rich experience. So these are the people that were helping me, Ángel Martinez and Marta Rodriguez. They assisted me with everything, were extremely generous. And another reason I was there is because Aurelio de los Reyes is basically the leading expert in silent Mexican film, and he is based in the Department of History there, and at the UNAM. So it's kind of a central figure of the area that I was trying to become more familiar with, and I was able to meet him and to speak with him. So that was also a positive experience for my research. So what I found, okay, So I spent 2 weeks watching as much as humanly possible. And so this is my attempt to kind of, in a very rudimentary way, organize, just the broad corpus of things that I found, okay? So in this period, right, what we can see, so we have, on the one hand, like a mythicized idealization sort of representation of indigenous people, and an example of this is Sitari from 1921, right? Then there's a lot of films that use this kind of historical lens, a lot of films about the colonial period, right, in which indigenous are kind of represented as this, uncivilized, quote unquote, mass, vis-a-vis the Spanish colonizers, right? So there's a lot of interest in this, in the 1920s and 1930s in representing the colonial moment. Then there's the ethnographic gaze. I was able, here we have an example, Peregrinación a Chalma from 1922. There's a lot of interest in appropriating the indigenous with a very distanced ethnographic gaze, right? So sort of claim them for identity purposes, but yet not compromise oneself by associating oneself with backwardsness, right? And then very little indigenismo, but 1934 Janitzio is kind of a precursor to the kind of work that we'll see by Elena Fernandez. He was actually in this film. So, and what we see in that early attempt is basically an ambiguity. There's not really any consensus as to what it would mean to represent the indigenous in the present, right? Outside of a mythicized idealization that harks back to, before the encounter, or outside of the colonial experience, or outside of the ethnographic approach. So it's kind of this new, I think, dilemma for Mexican film that Janitzio falls into. Okay, and so this is the how the indigenous female character is represented. She's not a professional actress. Okay. And okay, so if you all would I'd just like to share a few minutes of Sitari so that you can see the kind of materials I was viewing. Let's see if this comes with- Okay, so I'm going to show you a racy midnight encounter between the princess and the soldier, okay? Supposedly, okay, so this is the princess. It's very out of focus. Some of the shows are very hard to view. Okay. So this piece to me was, interesting because, again, so we have somewhat of a precursor for this interesting phenotypical representation of the indigenous, right? And there's a difference between male and female. Okay. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so why was this important? Okay, so first of all, in my case, dealing with audiovisual materials, for me there was no way forward in terms of constructing a genealogy of what film means in relation to the indigenous in this period in Mexico. I had to go see that, right? Also, the Filmoteca was extremely generous and they reproduced many materials for me. So this is important because it allows me to continue my analysis while I'm here, go back to them as often as I need to, and as well as I was authorized to share them in academic context, so I can share them with anyone in my department. I feel like I can contribute to my department's repertoire of film, and also as well in my teaching, right? I can incorporate that and use that as a tool. Right, so I was also able to access other materials, such as some of the books that I've been passing around, and I was able to meet with a leading expert in the field that I'm dealing with, so that was obviously enriching. And also, I was able to forge a very positive collaboration with UNAM. They, told me if anyone in our department is interested, now they are aware of who we are and they are interested in collaborating in the future. So I feel like that's a positive contribution that, it's beyond just my own personal need in this project. Okay, thank you.
We were discussing the first presentation. I forgot your name. So maybe it's our ignorance, so you have to enlighten us in this topic. We thought like anthropologists just look for people and community. Why are you looking for animals? That was interesting.
So that's a good question. I am a physical anthropologist, and anthropology is the study of humans and their closest living ancestors, non-human primates. And in terms of my research with predation, if you think about our human ancestors out on the savannah, they likely encounter predators much, much larger than jaguars and pumas on a regular basis. And so that would require mechanisms such as highly specialized systems of cognition, of perception, of communication. And anthropologists and other researchers have argued that predation is selected for a number of human traits. And this is highly debatable, but traits like bipedalism, group living, or cooperation in groups, and even body size. But when we're looking in anthropology at human ancestors, all we have is the fossil record, right? So we're having to make interpretations based on bones and material evidence. And so it's hard to reconstruct these things such as predation and behavior. So looking at our closest living ancestors can give us, you can't make direct inferences, but it can give us some kind of idea, shed light on how these behaviors, how communication's another part of my research I didn't discuss here, but how they may have developed, under what conditions, and also when they may have developed.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, how many films did you actually watch?
I watched about 50, and I came back with about 30.
And they're all like from the 1920s to the,
I have some, the very first things that were ever filmed in Mexico. Some of the most interesting things that I'm like super excited every time I see. I have a film Tepeyac from 1917, for example, that was restored there at the UNAM.
so you mostly watch silent films?
I watched all the way through as much as I could, so probably like the 1950s. But what I was trying to focus on was that early period that it's difficult for me to access materials from, being in the U.S. Yes.
From the photographs that I could actually see very well, they didn't seem to be very different, the oldest ones, from the current ones. That is, they appeared to be very non-indigenous looking.
Yeah, exactly, which of course I'm excited about, right? In fiction film. But as I mentioned, there do seem to be these other approaches, right? So the ethnographic approach. But in fiction film, I at this point, that seems to be what I'm finding. Yeah.
I have a question about that law of prior consultation. It sounds to me totally fraudulent. That's the way I see it. How are the indigenous folks handling this? What do they think about this law? I mean, it sounds to me like the government is saying, we'll consult you, but what does that mean?
But they're debating
An
if
email?
they exist. They're debating whether they exist or not. They can be named.
Yeah, but let's assume they do exist. What does consultation mean?
Right. So there's a lot of confusion, and first of all, you're right. They don't even know that this law was passed, at least the groups that were represented in these conferences that I went. Yeah, okay, they know that the law was passed, they don't even know what it actually means, and they don't even know what the role would be. And one of the demands that they were, what they were demanding before the law was okay, the law was drafted, and then they need the implementation, right, steps. And then the government called in all these indigenous community representative in tables of dialogue tables, right? To kind of put, how are we going to put this consultation together, what it actually means. And one of the problems that they identified was that it means consultation, but it doesn't mean veto. So it doesn't mean if they are against the mining company, it doesn't matter, because at the end, the government is going to be the one deciding what is best for the for the country, right? So it is consultation, and it's not very detailed. I've gone through, it's only like 4 or 5 pages right now. The law and the implementation is also very, very vague, and it's open for interpretation. So I thought that was one of the problems. And that's also the case with the current participation mechanisms that they had before the law was passed.
Is the law written in Spanish?
Yes.
Do they have versions in other languages? Like
I didn't
indigenous
find it in
Latino?
Quechua, no. But one of the requirements is to have a translator.
Okay.
But there's a problem with translator because I've also been told that the translator is hired by the mining company
Sure.
for the current participation, and they don't really translate the technicalities when they provide information about the environmental impact assessments.
Do you know what FENIMAG's official position is, the federal mining organization on the new law?
No, I didn't come across them, but the ones that are being more involved are organizations from the Amazon than from the Andes.
Should have come to my Tinker Talk a couple of weeks ago, because I look at informal mining and Madre de Dios and gold mining, and I'm also interested in how this new law might provoke or increase the informal mining sector. Did you get any kind of idea of whether there might be some economic changes as to whether it'll be less formalized mining if this becomes like a roadblock for mining companies?
So they didn't bring up much the topic about informal mining when they were talking about this, because the focus was about the indigenous, who are the indigenous people and what does this really mean for us? I mean, and also demanding that what's the point of the consultation if our opinion is not even going to be considered, right? So that was the focus. I didn't come across much about informal mining, but that would be interesting too.
And you were working on the Sierra, you
Yes.
were not working on the
Yeah.
Amazon, but your point is right. I mean,
Yeah.
most of the resistance is coming from the Amazon.
Yeah.
The same is happening in Ecuador.
But they are,
And in Bolivia.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
but I don't know if you're familiar with, but they are implementing this law in the Amazon with it's not in Madre de Dios, it's somewhere else, I can't remember. Because in the Amazon, they've already identified the indigenous community. But they want to do about 140 consultations at once, and that's going to be starting this year, or early next year.
Well, the other concern I would have is then there's FENARPE, which represents indigenous rights and indigenous interests in Peru. And from locals that I've talked to, FENARPE is also seen as a comfortable bedfellow with mining companies and works in collusion with mining companies against the interests of indigenous communities, where their elites might get paid off and allow mining to happen in their concessions.
Right, so there's a lot of local conflict, internal conflict within the communities, right? I can't generalize that all communities are against mining. And that's for example, one of the, this workshop that they were talking to me about, they said that the ones that were pro-mining and wanted to develop this project would sit at the front, and the ones who were against would sit in the back, and they were not kind of allowed to get closer, and they're also blocking some of the NGOs from filming as well. So there's a lot of internal conflict within also the communities, and corruption from really low level corruption to all levels.
from money coming from the mining companies.
Yeah, they say that the mining companies are maybe also co-opting the communities, so they're buying support, right, from communities, and then they also split them.
Yeah.
So you have one community saying, no, I'm the chief, I'm the director of this community organization, saying, no, actually, I am the director. Yeah, it's quite complicated.
I mean, the saddest thing is that this is absolutely the same thing that has been going on for such a long time. I mean, we can talk about details here and there, here and there, but actually the fact that, I mean, at these days, they are arguing. I mean, they are arguing whether, I mean, there are indigenous peoples in a country like Peru. This is something that it blows your mind. I mean, it's absolutely
It was a stupid thing.
right.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it's not. I mean, it's not an issue of. I mean, how do you? I mean, and the issue. I mean, because they come with. Well, we have to define who is indigenous, and so we can name the indigenous.
Right.
But it's the same kind of argument that has been around since colonial times.
But and then in Lima, they tell me why is this law only for indigenous? And what about the non-indigenous, right? Do we not have the right for
Yeah, what about
consultation?
people who are mestizo, or,
Yeah.
I mean, but, you know, people who might speak Quechua speakers, and, yeah, Andinos who speak Quechua but have a, you know, grandparents who speak Quechua, and then grandparents who are from Lima, or from Arequipa, or somewhere else, and they're not.
Because it is clearly one of those, again, colonial examples of la ley se obedece pero no se cumple. I mean, they came out with this law to